Hello, everyone. If you want to start taking your seats, we're going to get started. Great, thank you. Well, hello again. My name is Crystal Chumney, and I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the New Canaan Library. Welcome to the 9th Annual Anita Houston Lecture, sponsored by the Library and the United Nations Committee of New Canaan. We are delighted and honored this year to have Lindsay Addario with us, and it's such a great turnout. Thank you so much for your support. I am just a few housekeeping items up front, so please turn off or silence all your electronic devices. The restrooms are out the back door and to the left and down the small hallway on the left. Lindsay's book, It's What I Do, will be for sale in the lobby area and was for sale before as well by Elm Street Books. After the Q&A, there'll be a signing up to the left, and then we'll have a small reception out in the lobby, and books will still be for sale. We're going to hear a few words from Mariana Houston, which will be followed by an introduction from Pete Runette. I also wanted to say thank you again for supporting the library in this fantastic lecture series.
Hello and welcome. I'm Mariana Houston, Anita Houston's daughter, and I'm here with Catherine Bradford, my older sister. Anita's their daughter. And it's so wonderful to have this memorial lecture series every year and to get a chance to remember Anita, who was quite a character. And but I know that so many people in New Canaan said what we loved about Anita is that she made us think. And that's where this lecture series was born. She also loved to photograph her trips and was not very discerning. She would bring her photographs to Breslow Brothers or whatever it was to have them developed, and then she would come back with a stack like this of marketplaces and laundry lines, and always children. She always photographed children, but it was her way of bringing those exotic places back to us, and we loved it. So this year, the lecture almost didn't happen because Pete said, oh dear, I think our speaker is canceled out. I don't know that we'll have a memorial 2015 lecture. And I got in touch with Kathy's son-in-law, David Kirkpatrick, who was the New York Times bureau chief in Cairo and is now the New York Times bureau chief in London. And I said, Dave, what can we do? There must be somebody wonderful. And he said, I know just the person. And when I just said hello to Lindsay, she said, oh, sure, I know Dave. We met when I was in jail in Libya. So we're on to an amazing lecture and presentation by Lindsay, and I'm so delighted that she's here. And now we'll hear from Pete Runette.
Good afternoon. Welcome all. I'm Pete Runette, co-chair of the United Nations Committee of New Canaan, along with Shakeba Wakili Bennett, who is also here. And we're delighted to welcome Lindsay to the fray. I wanted to say a couple words about Anita. As Mimi mentioned, she's a very unusual person. And it's a pleasure every year at least to remember Anita. She was actually a great believer in everything in the work of the United Nations, and an equally strong interest in the international issues that challenged both the United States and the United Nations. And above all, I guess, she loved ideas, which was a terrific attribute, and she was basically a really wonderful person. Lindsay Addario is an American photojournalist who regularly works with the New York Times, National Geographic, and Time magazine. She was, in fact, a neighbor, having lived in Westport and graduated from Staples High School. After graduating from the University of Wisconsin, Lindsay began photographing professionally for the Buenos Aires Herald in 1996. She had, in fact, been given a camera by her father in a preteen stage and had self-taught so that she knew which way to point it, at least. But she found herself in need of some work in Buenos Aires and obviously started an enormous career. In 2000, she traveled to Afghanistan to document life under the Taliban and has since covered conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, Darfur, South Sudan, and Congo. In 2015, American Photo magazine named Lindsay as one of the 5 most influential photographers in the past 25 years. She has received the MacArthur Fellowship and was part of a team of journalists from the New York Times that won a Pulitzer for international reporting in 2009. In 2011, she was awarded the Overseas Press Club's Olivier Robert Award for her series, Veiled Rebellion, Afghan Women. Lindsay's recent work included the resilience of children in conflict for the New York Times Magazine, the plight of Syrian refugees for the New York Times, and the civil war in South Sudan, and maternal mortality in Sierra Leone for Time. She released a new book, New York Times bestseller, earlier this year, entitled It Is What I Do, which chronicled her life as a photojournalist coming of age in the 9/11 world. It's clearly a young life, but action-packed, for now at least. Perhaps her impact so far is best summarized by her MacArthur Foundation Award, which describes it best. Addario's dedication to demystifying foreign cultures and exposing the tragic consequences of human conflict is drawing much-needed attention to conflict zones around the world and providing a valuable historic record for future generations. Please welcome Lindsay Addario.
Thank you all for coming, especially on such short notice. I'm going to start with a short video.
And now some new information and disturbing information just into us. The New York Times now says that 4 of its journalists reporting on the conflict in Libya have gone missing.
4 journalists, 2 reporters, and 2 photographers for the New York Times disappeared on Tuesday.
Editors say they have not heard from Anthony Shadid, Stephen Farrell, Tyler Hicks, and Lindsay Addario. 4 New York Times journalists were held captive. They'd been reporting from the eastern city of Ajdabiya. The Times executive editor says the paper has been in contact with the Libyan government, and they were assured that the 4 would be released promptly if they had been captured.
Libyan authorities said the group was captured in eastern Libya last week by forces loyal to Colonel Gaddafi.
So most people ask me how I got started covering war, and I grew up in Westport. This is me when I was about 2 years old. So fairly typical upbringing. This is our family portrait, very 70s style. And this was a typical weekend. I was raised by hairdressers. So on the weekends, there were mock weddings and all sorts of things went on at my house. A little eccentric. In 2000, I moved to India. I wanted to become a foreign correspondent, and I was interested in life overseas. And I moved to India, and very shortly after, my roommate at the time said, you know, you're a woman and you're interested in women's issues, and you should go to Afghanistan and cover life under the Taliban for women. And I was about 26 years old, and I didn't think twice. It seemed like the most natural thing to do. So I sent a bunch of emails and started researching, and I called my mother the night before I was leaving, and I said, Mom, I'm going to Afghanistan tomorrow. And she said, okay, honey, have a good time. So I went. Photography was illegal at the time, and I ran around with my cameras in a bag and started shooting life for women under the Taliban. This is a very typical scene at that time. I photographed women in their homes, and ironically, it was easier to photograph women at that time in their homes because there were no newspapers and there was no television. Everything was illegal and banned under the Taliban. So people, Afghans, were much more open to being photographed because they knew those images would never make it back there. This was a hospital under the Taliban. Very few doctors. Most of the doctors and nurses had fled. Almost no medicine. This is in the women's ward. And this is a woman in labor under the Taliban. After September 11th, I put my hand up to go cover the fall of the Taliban in Kandahar. And this is one of the pictures from Kandahar shortly thereafter. I still didn't really have combat experience, but I was determined to cover the war in Iraq. I had an agency at the time, which was Corbis, and I'll just read you a short excerpt from the book. Hold on 1 minute. You don't have to. This is an email I sent to my editor. I was on assignment in South Korea, and he kept emailing me saying, you know, you have to get prepared to cover the war in Iraq, and I was sort of in denial that I was actually going to cover combat. And he said, you know, you need to order body armor and helmets, and finally I sent him this email. Dear Scott, I'm trying to buy body armor for my impending departure for Iraq, and I'm starting to break out in hives. I called AKE War Outfitters like you suggested, and they put me on hold for 3 minutes, knowing I was calling from Korea, so I hung up. I then checked the websites you recommended, and I'm not sure if I just tried to read Korean. Basically, I have no idea what I'm looking at. Ballistic, 6-point adjustable, tactical armor, etc. Please understand this language is not familiar to me. I grew up in Connecticut and was raised by hairdressers. Would it be possible for you to call Second Chance in the States and explain to them that I'm a photographer, I'm going to either Baghdad with the US troops or into northern Iraq, I'm not as worried about bullets as I am about shrapnel, and I don't want anything too heavy. I guess that would mean ceramic plates. I don't want to spend $1 million, though my life may be worth a fraction of that one day. And these are my measurements. I'm sorry if this is too much information for you, but I photographed for 13 hours today. It's 1:30 in the morning, and I just want to get this planning over with. I'm 5'1". I have no idea what the circumference of my head is for helmet size, and I certainly have never measured the distance between my nipples. I would go downstairs and ask someone at the hotel for a measuring tape, but I don't think people at reception would send me anything to measure my head at 1:30 in the morning, because it would take them 3 hours to figure out what I'm asking for, and I would surely jump out the window. So let's just say I have a medium head. As for my vest, my waist is 29 inches, my chest is 34, and I have big boobs. So that's how I went to cover the war in Iraq. When I arrived, this is one of the first scenes I saw. The Kurdish Peshmerga, which were supported by American troops, were fighting Al-Ansar, which was one of the terrorist groups in northern Iraq and along the border with Iran. About 6 weeks after I arrived, Saddam Hussein fell, and so many of us journalists who were based in northern Iraq started making our way down towards Baghdad. This is in Kirkuk, and people immediately were euphoric. They were so happy Saddam had fallen. Very shortly after Saddam fell, the horrors of his regime became unearthed. There were mass graves south of Baghdad. This is in Hilla, and people would come, the Shiites who had been massacred under Saddam, to come claim the bodies of their loved ones. In each one of these white sheets is a body, and relatives would come and try and sift through these sheets and identify their loved ones based on any shards of clothing or anything that still remained inside. People were disillusioned by the lack of a plan after the fall of Saddam. They had very little water, no electricity. There was looting going on around the country. They broke out in riots. This is a woman who was waiting to withdraw money from the bank. And she was so thirsty, she came up to the American troops and said, "Please give me water." I wanted to see what it was like for the American troops, so I started doing my first military embeds. And in 2004, we went deep into the heart of the Sunni Triangle. The insurgency had just started, and the military took us out with them, journalists. Once you were vetted by the military, we went out with them. And in the middle of the night, we would go into people's homes and round up men. And as part of the looting, one of the things that often happened is there were fires around the country. people would go and steal wires and electrical wires, and they would start fires. And this is a woman looking for her husband in a factory. And I remember she was walking right towards the factory, and I said, "Don't go there because there might be secondary explosions." And she looked at me and said, "My husband's inside." And she looked at me as if I was crazy. Of course she's going to go in there and look for her husband. In 2004, Life magazine called me, and they said, "We have an assignment for you to photograph the wounded soldiers coming out of Fallujah." I was skeptical because at that point I still had never seen wounded soldiers. It was something our government was very, very savvy about not letting journalists see. We had been at war for several years at that point. I flew in, and I was working with a reporter whose father and grandfather were both medics with the military. And we were flown right into Balad Air Base, and that's where the wounded were coming out of the Battle of Fallujah. This is on my birthday, actually, in 2004. We walked into the inside of a C-17 cargo aircraft, and there were so many wounded coming out of Fallujah, they stripped the inside of the aircraft and laid all of the soldiers on the ground and had them on the sides of the walls. And this is how they flew to Germany for treatment. And this is a young man who had been injured in Fallujah, and this is how he was being flown to Germany. And these are images I had never seen in my years covering Iraq and Afghanistan. And when I got back, I filed those images to Life magazine. And I was so excited for them to be published because I thought, for sure, when Americans see these images, they'll turn against the war in Iraq. But my editor held them. They were never published through November, December, January, and February. And in mid-February, I got an email from my editor, and she said, "I hate to tell you this, but we will never publish your images from Iraq because the American public cannot handle them." I was so furious, I sent an email immediately to the New York Times, my editor, and she was able to get them in the New York Times Magazine shortly thereafter. In 2004, I started covering Darfur. The Sudanese government did not want journalists there, so we had to sneak in illegally through neighboring Chad. We walked in about a mile in and met up with the Sudanese Liberation Army rebels. This is a truckload of rebels. We were told we would have transport through Darfur. It ended up being 17 rebels and me and 3 other journalists on the back of a pickup truck for 5 days, so 21 of us driving through the desert. We saw burned villages, and the government was doing bombing campaigns. This is a village that had been burned several days before. There was only one helicopter that was going in there to do a food drop by the World Food Program. They said there was no space for journalists. And I was working with Lydia Polgreen for the New York Times. And she went to the landing strip, she went to where the helicopter was, and started screaming at them and said, "Do you know what the power of an image in the New York Times will do to motivate people to act against the war in Darfur?" And they said, "But there are no spaces. We have 8 staff that need to fly in." And she said, "At least put my photographer on the helicopter." And she managed to convince them. And I ended up getting this picture, and it was 6 columns across the front of the New York Times. And these are the displaced from that village. And in 2006, I was working with Lydia again, and we had heard that there was a massacre of government soldiers, and President Bashir denied it. He said, absolutely no government soldiers were killed. It was a lie. The rebels are lying. So Lydia and I were in Chad, and we went to the border, and we found a truck of rebels, and we said, "Please take us in." And they said, "It's really dangerous because there are Antonov aircraft flying overhead, and they might bomb you if you go in." And we said, "We don't care. We need to see it in order to report it in the New York Times." President Bashir is denying it. They said, okay. We got in the back of the truck, and as we drove towards the site, there were bodies clear across the desert of government soldiers. And we were able to report on this. And to me, this really illustrates the power of an image and the importance of journalism, and that you have to be there in order to show that governments do lie when it's convenient for them. In 2007, I was working with Elizabeth Rubin for the New York Times Magazine, and we wanted to go to Afghanistan to figure out why there were so many civilian casualties. In order to go there, we wanted to go to the Korangal Valley. It was the place in Afghanistan where the US military was dropping the most bombs. We went to the public affairs officer and said, "We'd like to go to the Korangal Valley." And he looked at Elizabeth and I and sort of laughed, and he said, "It's not a place that's fit for women." And we said, "Well, why not?" And he said, "Well, there's no place for you to sleep, and there's no place for you to go to the bathroom." And we said, "Well, where do the men sleep? And where do the men go to the bathroom?" And they said, "Well, the men sleep in bunkers on the side of a mountain." And we said, "Well, we can do that." And so he said, come back tomorrow. And we went back the next day, and they put us on Blackhawks, and they flew us out to the Korengal Valley because journalists do not abide by the same rules as military, and women were allowed on the front lines. As soon as we got out there, we ended up spending 2 months living on the side of the mountain with the troops. It was the 173rd Airborne. As soon as we got out there, we were immediately faced with mortar fire. This is in a bunker when we were being hit by mortars. And we went on about 7-hour-a-day patrols at 7,000 feet. And it was starting to be autumn, and so it was cold. And at the end of the 2 months, the military was gearing up for something called Operation Rock Avalanche. It was a battalion-wide operation where the military wanted to go into the heart of the insurgency in order to pull out the insurgents themselves and so that they could attack them. And so they were going into a place they hadn't gone in years, and they knew that we would be hit, but they wanted that to happen so that they can hit them back. We flew in, we were put on Blackhawks in the middle of the night, and everything was through night vision goggles. Night vision is very difficult to understand. You have no depth perception, and you can only see so far ahead. So we were flown in on Blackhawks, we jumped out, we landed onto the side of a mountain, it's pitch black, we're trying to see with our night vision, and we heard that the Taliban was approaching us almost immediately after landing. Obviously, helicopters are very loud, the Taliban knew that we had arrived. So the commander we were with, Captain Kearney, started calling in airstrikes. And I, as a photographer, we couldn't see anything. So I knew that there was combat going on, but I could only see what was directly in front of me. And I was so frustrated that I sat down on the mountain and I fell asleep. And I sort of woke up an hour later and I hear Kearney saying, "Addario, wake up, we're sparkling." And I thought, what? And I put on my night vision goggles and I was asleep with my helmet and my vest and my camera on. And I raised my goggles and this is what I saw. And what you're looking at is a JTAC. He's with the Air Force, and his job is to literally sparkle a target with a laser beam that is only visible through night vision so that the AC-130 pilot can see where to drop a bomb. The Taliban can't see this. Only the military can see this site. Then I fell back asleep. On the 6th day, we were ambushed by the Taliban. We were hit from 3 different sides. And Sergeant Rugal was killed. 2 of the other soldiers were shot, but they survived. About 1 year later, I got a call from Dexter Filkins from the New York Times. And I knew when Dexter called that it would be something dangerous. So he called up and he said, "Hey man, I got the best story for us." And I thought, oh no, here we go. And he said, it's on the Talibanization of Pakistan. And I remember Paul, who was working for Reuters at the time, who's now my husband, he looked at me and he said, "You're not going to meet the Taliban, are you?" And I just said, "No, absolutely not, of course not." And so Dexter went ahead, and he spent about a month lining up access with the Taliban. And then he called me up, and he said, "Okay, come in." And I flew into Islamabad and went up to Peshawar, which is very close to the tribal area where the Taliban was in control. And when I got there, we got a call from Haji Namdar, who was the commander. And he said, "You are welcome to come tomorrow, but the one thing you cannot do is bring a woman." So Dexter and I sort of looked at each other and thought, what will we do? And our translator, Halim, was terrified because he was very close to the Taliban, and he said, "What will we tell Haji Namdar? He said no women. How can we bring a woman?" And then he said, "I know. No Talib would leave his wife alone in a strange village, so you must come. You are Mr. Dexter's wife. We will say you are husband and wife, and you have to come together." So we said, okay. So we dress up as husband and wife, and we get in the car, and we go to meet Haji Namdar. When we arrive, Dexter goes inside, and I'm sitting in the car. I get brought inside, and I'm fully veiled. There's nothing showing. I'm seeing through my veil. And I sit down, and there are about 15 Taliban fighters in a very small room, about half the size of this stage. And it was very awkward, obviously not a place that many women go. And I sit down, and Dexter says, "Hey man, Haji Namdar, thanks for having us. Here's my wife, and you know, my wife happens to have a camera. Do you mind if she takes some photos?" So I thought, I can't believe he would believe that. So I started taking some pictures through my veil, and about 15 minutes into it, people started getting really fidgety. And I thought, oh God, this is where they kill us. We're here, we're so stupid. Why would we think that they're not going to kill us or kidnap us? And so a guy comes over and he says, "Madam," and this is also one of the most hospitable parts of the world. So when you're invited to someone's house, even if it's the Taliban, they will serve you tea or lunch. It's part of their honor. So he says, Madam, we would like to serve you tea, but we don't know how you can drink the tea through your veil. And I said, well, I was sort of laughing because, of course, they couldn't see me laughing. And so I'm laughing to myself, thinking, this is so ridiculous. It's the Taliban, and they're stressing about giving me tea. So he says, please, go to the corner of the room, face the wall with your back to us, lift your veil, drink your tea, and you can come back, and no one will see your face. So that was meeting the Taliban. In 2009, I had just gotten the MacArthur Fellowship, and I wanted to start covering why women die in childbirth in Afghanistan, maternal mortality. At that time, about 500,000 women died in childbirth a year, and I wanted to know why. Many of the reasons women die in childbirth is because they cannot get to a hospital or a clinic or a trained medical professional. They're in labor, they have to get on the back of a donkey or walk for 12 hours in order to get to a doctor. So I was covering for about 2 weeks in very remote clinics and hospitals how women were getting prenatal care. And on the way back, I was driving with Dr. Ziba, who was my translator, and we saw these two women on the side of the mountain. And we both knew something was wrong, because in Afghanistan, women are always accompanied by a man. And there was no man here. So we stopped the car and ran up the hill, and it turned out that the woman on the right, Noor Nisa, was in labor, and her water had just broken, and her husband's first wife died in childbirth. And he was so determined to not lose Noor Nisa that he borrowed money from villagers and rented a car. That's an extraordinary expense for an Afghan. And when we met them, the car had broken down. So I said, please get in the car with me and I'll take you to the hospital. And they said, we can't, we need permission from her husband. So I looked at Ziba, and there was one road, luckily, that went through the province, and I said, go find her husband. So she got in the car, she went. She brought the husband back, and he said, okay, let's go to the hospital. Everyone got in my car, and she delivered safely. We brought her to Faizabad, and she delivered. And everyone asked me if I took more photographs of her delivery and the child, and I did not, because I changed the story with my presence. They probably never would have made it to the hospital had I not given them a ride. So I didn't think it was journalistically ethical to actually keep shooting. So of this whole series, I only shot about 3 frames. I continue doing the maternal mortality work in Sierra Leone. Again, the same issues are present. This is a very typical scene of a woman who's in labor or who is going to get prenatal care. She has to walk for 4 or 5 hours to get to a hospital. And when she arrives, this is what the hospital or clinic looks like. There's often no doctor, no medical professional. This is a woman in labor in Freetown, in the main hospital in Sierra Leone. I went to the Magbaraka Government Hospital because I heard that's where the numbers were the highest of women dying in childbirth. There's one doctor in this entire province for all the women and all the men in the entire province. When I met Mama Cisse, she was pregnant with twins. She had delivered the first baby in her village, and the second baby wouldn't come out. In order to get to the hospital, her sister, who was a midwife, sent her an ambulance. But to get to that ambulance, she had to get in a canoe, go across the river, meet up with the ambulance, and go for 6 hours to get to the hospital. And that's when I met her. She had 1 baby delivered and 1 she was still in labor with. And we talked extensively about her life. She was 16 years old when she was pulled out of school and forced to get married. She wanted to stay in school and study, but her father wanted her married. And this is her in labor. And she finally delivered the second baby, and it was almost unresponsive, but the midwives, with very little, brought the child back to life. But she started hemorrhaging. And I'm not a doctor, and I kept saying, she's bleeding. Can we do something? And they said, no, it's fine, it's normal. And they were just sort of mopping up the blood, and it kept going on for about 10 minutes. I felt very uncomfortable, and I went to the doctor where he was, and he was in surgery. And I sort of looked at him, and he looked at me, and I ran back, and I said, I don't know, take her blood pressure. Again, I'm not a trained medical professional, and it was 60/30 at that point. They picked her up and carried her to the doctor who was on the other side of the hospital. And when he came out of surgery, he attended to her, but she died. And this is her mother finding out her daughter has just died. And I went back to the village with them, and this is her funeral. It was a very traditional funeral. In 2011, I wanted to cover the uprising in Libya. I had missed the uprising in Tunisia and Egypt because I was on assignment for National Geographic in Iraq. And I called the New York Times and said, I want to go to Libya. And I said, okay. And like so many journalists, we snuck in illegally through Egypt. It was the only way to cover the uprising in eastern Libya, was to sneak in without a visa. And we knew that the biggest risk for us journalists was that we might run into Gaddafi's troops, because Gaddafi did not want journalists there. He said repeatedly, if you see journalists, you should kill them. They're all spies. So we started covering the uprising. This is a call to arms in the very early days. As you can see, they're not trained soldiers. You see teachers, doctors, engineers. It looked like a Monty Python skit. Most of them had no idea what they were doing, and they just threw on green clothes and ran towards the front line. We moved forward with them. It was a handful of photographers. The photographers are usually always at the front because we need the images. We moved forward with them. This is one of the rebels standing on a gate looking to see if Gaddafi's troops were up ahead. And the fighting was very, very difficult. The terrain in Libya is flat, and there's one road that cuts through the desert from east to west. And Gaddafi's troops would move in from the west, and the rebels would move towards them from the east, and the fighting would happen on a very open road. On March 15th, 2011, I was working with Tyler Hicks, Anthony Shadid, and Steve Farrell, and we were in two separate cars. One of the things journalists do to prevent things from going wrong is to take two separate cars. If one car breaks down, you have a backup. The fighting was incredibly intense that day. We knew that the city of Ajdabiya was going to fall, but we wanted to get fresh reporting. We wanted to be there. So Gaddafi's troops were moving in. We moved towards the front line. We were covering the fighting, and as it got very close to us, we pulled back into the city. At that point, the driver of Steve and Anthony's car, his brother was shot at the front line, and he stopped the car and he dumped all of their stuff on the sidewalk and left. And so the four of us ended up in one car with our driver, Mohammed. At that point, we had to make a decision as to whether to stay or go. We were starting to get calls saying Gaddafi's troops were in the city. We wanted to go back to the hospital to see if there were civilian casualties. We went to the hospital at that point and started getting phone numbers of doctors in case the city did fall. We needed local contacts to find out what was going on. Then we went back to the front line, and as we were at the front line, we heard that there were snipers in the city. That typically means that Gaddafi's troops are close enough, if there are snipers, that they're already in the city. We finally made a decision to pull back towards Benghazi, and as we started driving towards Benghazi, we ran directly into one of Gaddafi's checkpoints. This is the exact location we were taken. What you see is Brian Denton's name on the left. He's a colleague of mine for the New York Times. He went back after and took this photo. We were stopped basically where his name was. And you have to make a decision when you approach a hostile checkpoint. Do you stop and say, hey, we're journalists, don't kill us? Or do you keep driving and you hope they don't open fire on you? Our driver panicked. He stopped the car, threw open the door, jumped out, and said, Sahafa, we're journalists. At that point, Gaddafi's troops opened all the doors of the car and sort of ripped everyone out of the car. I was sitting behind the driver on the left-hand side and put my head in my lap and sort of prayed that it would all go away. And then eventually in that moment, the rebels that we had been covering started opening fire on Gaddafi's troops. So our car was directly in the line of fire. I felt bullets all around us, you can hear it, and I decided to crawl out the right-hand side of the car. As I jumped out, one of Gaddafi's troops was pulling at my cameras and my waist pack, and I instinctively, very stupidly, was fighting back with him in the middle of this big gun battle. Eventually, I realized to let go of my cameras, and I made a run for it to that building. Oops. Sorry about that. So I made a run for it. At that point, that's hilarious. Sorry about that. No, we don't want El Capitan. So we knew that in order to stay alive, we had to get out of the line of fire. And the only way to do that was to find a place to hide. So that building provided us with cover. We each ended up running behind that building, and immediately we were told to lie face down in the dirt. And we knew that we would be executed. And each one of us had a gun put to our heads. We were lying side by side, sort of staring up into the barrel of a gun, saying, please don't kill us. Each one of us was begging for our lives. And at that moment, a commander came over and said, you can't kill them, they're American. We don't know why he said that, but Anthony later translated that for us. At that moment, they stopped. They took my shoes off my feet, pulled my laces out of my shoes, and started tying my wrists behind my back and my feet together. And they picked me up and put me back in a vehicle on the front line. Each one of us, I was placed in a car with Steve Farrell. Tyler and Anthony were placed together in a different vehicle a few feet ahead. And we were held there for hours as bullets and bombs landed all around us. And we were tied up. There was nothing we can do. We were repeatedly punched in the face, threatened with execution. The men were hit in the back of the heads with gun butts. For me, as a woman, I was groped. And this went on for the first 3 days. We were shuttled around the front line, put in prison, and on the third day, we were flown to Tripoli. And at that point, we were put under house arrest in a sort of VIP prison. We were told, if you look out the window, we will kill you. And we had no idea how long we would be there. At one point on the first day that we arrived there, they said, make a grocery list. And we all said, we don't need anything, we just need coffee. And they came back with 25 bags of groceries, and we thought, we're never getting out of here. And eventually, on the 6th day, we were released. 2 weeks after we were released, Brian Denton went back to the site. Our driver was never found. We assumed he was killed in those initial moments. And Brian went back with a colleague for the New York Times to see if he was still in prison or if they could find his body. And when they went back, they found my sneaker on the side of the road. It was still there. After Libya, I wanted to cover the war in Syria, but I did not want to go into Syria. I didn't want to get kidnapped again, so I started covering the refugee crisis. And this is a body of work I worked on for about 2 years for the New York Times. And this is in Zaatari camp in Jordan, refugees arriving. And this is begging for bread in the morning at a food distribution. And Syria has always had a tradition of marrying their girls young, but with the war and people living in close proximity in the camps, people are marrying their daughters at 12, 13 years old because they think it will protect them from getting raped. So this is a tradition that's going on even more than ever now since the war has started. This is a burial for a fighter in Lebanon. Lebanon has over 1 million Syrians living. It's more than, I think, 1/4 of their population. This is in Lebanon, a girl who was hit by shrapnel. People live in caves, in garages, and all sorts of unconventional housing in Lebanon because the government does not want camps. They're scared that after the Palestinians came, they're terrified that the same thing will happen with Syrian refugees all over the country. So people are not allowed to live in camps. They live in factories like this or in caves. And this is in Turkey along the border. And I'll just show some pictures of me at work. This is me in Pakistan on assignment, in Iraq in 2003. Crossing into Darfur illegally, in Darfur, in Afghanistan, Korangal Valley, it's Korangal Valley, Afghanistan, 7 months pregnant in Gaza, and this is my family. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. We'll give you a second to catch your breath there. And we're going to do about 10 minutes of Q&A. And so turn the other one on. Okay.
First of all, thank you so much. I applaud your courage, your tenacity.
Thank you.
Sort of a two-part question. In 2006, in your photos from Afghanistan, you showed a picture of a beautiful young boy. Did you know anything about him? Do you know anything about him? And the flip side is professionalism now notwithstanding, how do you keep your emotions in check?
Okay, so I'll answer the first question first, and then I'll do the second question. The picture of the boy is a very controversial picture because that is a picture I took when I was flying into the Korangal Valley with Elizabeth. We stopped for a few days at a command center, and we were able to witness something that had previously been off limits for journalists. It was the control room, and there all of the commanders in a certain area look at drone feeds, heat-censored feeds. There are screens all over the room. It's very confidential. They don't want anything photographed because obviously the Taliban will then know the tactics of the military. So we went into that room and there was a battle going on. There were troops in contact. They had been pinned down for hours. And eventually the commander made a decision to drop a bomb on this village and take out the Taliban. When they did that, they knew that there would be civilian casualties. But that was the only way to get the troops out. So they did that, and we asked to fly into that exact village the next day, which we did. They flew us directly in. We went to the base, the Korangal outpost called the COP. When we arrived, that boy was taken in with his brother. And he was in the medical tent being helped. And it's very ironic, obviously. The US bombs people and then they come for treatment to the US base, but that's the only place to go in a lot of these villages. When I went in, I took pictures of the boy, and his family said he was in one of the houses very close to where the bomb fell the night before. And so I said to the medic, as a journalist, we have to get both sides, obviously. So we got the interview with the family, then I interviewed the medic. I said, do you think these wounds are consistent with what they're saying? He said, no, I think these are old wounds. So I wrote that in my caption, because I thought I would only be in the Korangal for 5 days, 2 weeks. That was maximum journalists usually got. And I assumed I would update it when I ended up filing my pictures. We ended up staying 2 months. And at the end of that, we went on this Operation Rock Avalanche that was incredibly dramatic, and soldiers were killed and shot. And so I assumed those would be the pictures I had to focus on. So I was working on those captions. When I filed the picture of the boy, the old caption was still in there. It was slated to be a cover of the New York Times Magazine. It was being considered. And frantically, I started getting calls. This is 4 months later, the story was finally going to press, saying, what happened to this boy? Because in your caption, it says he wasn't injured in the bomb. And I said, no, I just didn't update it. This is what happened. And I explained the entire story I just explained to you. I said the military was just covering for themselves because they don't want to be responsible for civilian casualties. But in my opinion, we saw it. We saw it unfold on the screen. We saw the boy. We met the family. And this is the story. And I think we should talk about the ambiguity of war. These are the two sides that are being presented. Well, the editor-in-chief started speaking with the military and asking their opinion, and the military said, no, he wasn't injured, and they pulled the picture from the layout because they didn't believe me, they believed the military. And that picture was never published in the New York Times. And so that's part of what I do in journalism and the frustrations that I face, obviously. And the second question, how do I keep my emotions intact? I don't. I mean, I'm often on assignment, and in these very dramatic situations, I am very emotional. I mean, when Mama Cisse, the woman in Sierra Leone, died, I was crying and shooting. I mean, it's very emotional.
Thank you. Could you tell us something about the technical side of your photography?
Can you oh, okay, thanks.
Tell us something about the technical side of your photography. How do you deal with running out of batteries? What kind of lenses do you like to use, cameras? How do you protect your SD cards from being stolen?
Sure. I mean, I trash my equipment. For me, my philosophy is cameras are made to be used. So I use them and I use them. I carry 2 bodies usually. I have about 4 or 5 lenses. It depends. If I'm going into combat, I might take an extra body because things get ruined very quickly. I usually have a large zoom, like an 80 to 200. I have several fixed lenses. I like to use 1.4 lenses, so 28, 35, 85. And then I carry tons of batteries. I always have about 5 or 6 batteries because in a lot of the places I work, you can't get electricity very easily. So you have to turn off your cameras in between shoots. That answer.
More questions? Oh, now a bunch of hands.
That's a boy. He's in Westport right now. He's in Westport. He's here.
I heard your interview on NPR, and you talked about the dilemma of being with your family as opposed to traveling to war zones. Could you discuss that a little bit?
Sure. Everyone asked, have I stopped covering combat since I became a mother? I still work in war zones, but I'm not actively covering the front line. I'm not sure if with terrorism there is a front line anymore. I think there's a lot of gray area, and a lot of the places I work are extremely dangerous, even if there's no fighting, because there's a lot of kidnapping that's happening now. Journalists are increasingly a target. That's one of the main sort of answers to that question. But I think it's hard. I've tried to tone down, but it's also a different time. You know, we don't have troops in Afghanistan and Iraq the way we did 10 years ago. So I'm also not faced with, do I go on military embeds or not, because they don't exist anymore. He's right there. And he was a journalist, and he sits right there. He was a journalist, and now he's consulting. You could talk to him. Feel free.
Just a minute. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi.
A lot of people that are here today are clients of your dad's. And we're very, very proud of you, as is he, and your family. And we all have been sort of living through their eyes, hearing everything that you've been doing in the past. And
Sorry about that.
no, we're very, very proud of you. And your family certainly has a lot to be proud of. I commend you, as I'm sure everybody else would, for what you do. But being a mommy and also providing your family with a grandchild that they so adore, I know that, as this question was asked previously, there was obviously great concern for your safety. But I was thinking today, when my husband and I were talking about you and just reminiscing about your book that we both read, how do you feel as a photojournalist with what's going on in the world, especially with the refugees in Syria and the horrific problems with 4 million refugees, homeless, and most of them children? How can we make a difference when it seems that they're deaf ears? And do you find that frustrating as a photojournalist?
Yeah, I find it frustrating, but I have to be ideal, because I couldn't do this job if I didn't believe my work didn't make a difference. You know, I think that part of our job is to get people like you all to care about Syrian refugees, about women in Sierra Leone, about all of the issues I cover. And I think that if you care about something, there are a lot of organizations that are working to help these people, and you can always support those organizations. I mean, that, you know, they're always looking for funding, they're always looking for support, and I think that that's the way that you can help.
Hi, I'm a journalist, and so when I read your book, I thought it was really interesting to sort of compare and contrast how you work versus how a print journalist works. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the working partnership between photojournalists and print journalists, and also how you think the challenges differ for a photojournalist, or maybe particularly a female photojournalist on the front lines versus a female print journalist.
I'll start with the first question. It's always advantageous when you have a partner sort of in crime. I think for many years I worked with a woman named Elizabeth Rubin, and we covered Iraq, Afghanistan, Darfur, Saudi Arabia. We covered many, many countries together over 10 years. And when you have that relationship, it's great because you understand how the other person works, and you usually help each other in a way like, I see things that maybe she doesn't see, or she sees things that I don't see, and we help each other by asking a lot of questions. That's really important. That's not an easy relationship to have, and as budgets are, as publications don't have less money, they're not really willing to send partners always to the same place together. Sometimes they'll send a writer ahead or whoever is staff, and then I'll get given sort of 5 days to shoot an entire story after the writer has gone in. So it's harder to have those relationships now than it was, say, 10, 15 years ago. I don't know if it's harder or easier for women versus men. I actually find it a great advantage to be a woman on the front line or anywhere, because I think in many of the, I work mostly in the Muslim world and in the Middle East and Africa, and people always underestimate me. And I love that, because then I can sort of move around under the radar. And I think people, you know, I often get invited into people's homes and I can meet the women of the family and the men of the family. So for me, it's a great advantage to be a woman. And I think with any job, each sort of aspect of the job has its challenges. You asked about print versus photographer. I mean, some countries I work in, photography is incredibly taboo, like Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan. To photograph women, it's very difficult, whereas writers can talk to whoever they want. On the flip side, there are some places where pictures are easy, and then the writers can't get any interviews because they're scared of the government or something. So I think in every country, there are challenges.
So you and other conflict photographers obviously work really hard and go into dangerous places to get us the story. What stories do you think that you're aware of are not being told or not being told sufficiently right now?
I think there are certain countries that are incredibly hard to get into, you know? I mean, like, for example, for a journalist to get into a place like Eritrea, almost impossible, you know? And this whole refugee crisis, we see the Syrians, but the number 2 in the refugees are Eritreans, but no one can actually get into Eritrea. So that's a very difficult story to report on. For example, North Korea. You know, there are places where you can go if you are willing to report what the government wants you to report. I mean, in one aspect, that's better than nothing. But then again, you're not showing the reality, sort of the hardship. So there are a lot of stories, and that's often places that are hard to access.
We have time for one more question.
Lindsay, you mentioned that you get emotional, and you're obviously confronted with ridiculously insane situations. How much does your lens, your camera, insulate you emotionally from those situations so that it's not all raw data coming in?
A lot. I actually, when I feel myself getting emotional, I usually put my camera up to my face, and it's when I take it down that I feel myself like connecting to the person on a more human level. And it sounds horrible, but for me, it's much easier to keep my camera up and stay focused on my job, because I'm much more effective if I can actually tell that story succinctly. I mean, there was a story in Uganda that I was working on breast cancer. And there was a woman I had been following, Jolly, for like 6 days, and on the last day she died. And I went, her daughters didn't know she died. And so her Jolly's sister sort of put her in a casket and put her inside of like a bus to take her back to the village, and picked her daughters up from boarding school and brought them. And they just brought her into the kids into this bus and opened the casket, and there's their mother. And the girls just started screaming, "Mama!" And I was crying so hard I couldn't even shoot. I just sort of held my camera and was trying, but everything's out of focus. I mean, I couldn't even shoot. So, I mean, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Thank you again, Lindsay, and thank you for the Q&A. Thank you again, everyone, and a reminder, books are for sale outside. Please exit through the Main Street door to your right, and there's refreshments, and if you do want your book signed, please line up on the left-hand side of the room. Thank you again.